Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, Leadership Tip of the Week, Being Authentic, a discussion with Colin Newlin. Colin's a popular guest on the show and is on a mission to decrapify work. Question of the week, how do you spot an introvert? This week is an audio sign to watch out for. Just before speaking to Colin, we've escaped the grips of Halloween. The nights have suddenly got a lot colder and darker, and we've heard many stirring, although perhaps less authentic speeches about saving the planet at COP26. Authentic is one of those words that seems to get thrown around a lot, both in leadership and the speaking world. I don't know about you, but every time I hear somebody say, I'm authentic, I have the same reaction as when they say, with respect, and go on to disrespect. To be authentic might sound obvious. Why wouldn't you be? But then, those inauthentic people you see, and you see some, I'm sure, probably say the same. Although being authentic sounds like a good thing, what is it? I ask, as I think many people, especially introverts, look for a wide range of signals to determine authenticity, none of which include the famous statement, of course, I'm authentic. How do you determine if somebody's authentic? Is it important to you? Do you ensure that you could pass your own tests? Words not matching actions is the most obvious, and if you want the introverts in your team on side, try really listening rather than saying, I'm a good listener. Add a summary of what they say before moving on and giving your thoughts. At least somebody then knows you heard them. Be proud of your personality, its foibles, and show your personality. Maybe that's one for introverts to consider, as many try to behave like extroverts, which of course leads to this week's question from Andy. I would love your thoughts on authenticity, and if you'd like to discuss it with me in a couple of weeks, get in touch. Speaking of help, what's your question about introversion, leadership and performance? Every week I answer one question and invite the owner of the question onto the show. To ask your question, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk, where there's a box near the top of the page. You can then choose if you want to ask it live or not. But let's get on and speak to Colin. Welcome, Colin. How are you doing?
Hi, John. I'm very good, thank you.
Good. Now, I'm going to quickly give a warning to everybody that's listening to today's episode. If you haven't already worked it out, if you're of a nature of not liking words like decrapify, you might want to listen again next week instead, because we're starting this conversation, Colin, on the back of an article you wrote in LinkedIn, which got huge amounts of discussion going, and I loved. And the article was called Drowning in Horse Shit. So I want to come back to that, and I want to explore what was going on in that article. But just before we do that, would you like to tell us if you're an introvert, an extrovert, and more importantly, how that affects you?
I'm something of an ambivert, I guess, but with a tendency towards introversion. I like to be with people and talking to people, getting ideas, but I don't like to be with lots of people I don't know particularly. I find that draining. And then when I've been with people, then I like to go away by myself and process it and think about it and get ready for the next sort of bout of interaction. So I definitely need that introversion space, if you like, but I also need the stimulus of other people.
I think that's interesting because lots of people would say on that basis, you can't be an introvert, but you know what? You want that space to recharge, and the fact that you need stimulation from talking with people, nothing wrong with that. So do I, and so do lots of people. Thank you. Tell me about decrapifying work, if I can start there, because that's your title on LinkedIn, which I love. Might be just good to understand what you mean by it.
Well, it's interesting because very few people ask me what I mean by it. They all seem to know themselves what they mean by it, and that's good enough for them.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
But it's based around a premise that I came up with that over the last 30, 40 years, during my career, that we've had a process of crapification of work, that there's been numerous forces that have interacted with each other to actually make the work experience less and less pleasant. And we can see that because we've seen employee engagement at a pitiful level. We know that levels of stress and illness are going up. People are working longer hours. People are less satisfied with work. And I think we need to reverse that process.
It's interesting. I'm listening to that and thinking, when you're talking about reducing employee engagement and people being more sick, and it kind of makes me think about industrial revolution kind of stuff. Maybe that's something we'll pick up on later on, but that also leads us into drowning in horse shit. Tell us a little bit about the article, what was behind it and what some of the reactions were.
It was really driven by this debate about the office and the future of the office, and we can't change things. We've got to get everybody back into offices and into city centres. A while ago, I came across this article about the great horse manure crisis, which is this article in the Times where somebody wrote, in 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet manure.
Oh, lovely. What a vision.
And the story was that this then got debated at the first town planning conference in New York a few years later, and they couldn't come up with a solution. Actually, all of that is a myth, right? There was no article, there was no conference, or it wasn't discussed at the conference. The conference happened. But it was true. There was a very real problem with disposing of the outputs, shall we say, of horse-drawn transport, which was the dominant transport method in all cities at the time. And large bits of infrastructure were devoted to dealing with the output. Opposite King's Cross Station, where there are now, houses and pubs and all that sort of stuff, that used to be holding yards for the manure that had been collected on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah.
And then it would be put on trains and shipped out to the country. And behind King's Cross Station were knackers yards and tanning salon, tanning works and all this sort of stuff. It was quite an unpleasant part of the town, which dealt with all the dead horses, because horses generally have a life of about 3 years on the streets of London. As the city was growing and more people were coming into it and more transport was happening, it was just like more and more stuff to deal with. People really didn't know what was going to happen. You just couldn't see a way forward. It was also causing disease and all sorts of things. And then, of course, the mass availability of motor cars came along, and also electric trams. And in a fairly short space of time, we stopped using horses and we started using other means of transport, and we didn't need all this infrastructure, and the problem resolved itself.
The infamous, I think, 'cause I hate the phrase, paradigm shift, or perhaps to quote something that was talked about a lot a year ago, the new normal.
Well, indeed, it was the new normal. My observation really was that we have all this sort of panic in some quarters about the demise of the office, and yet actually the way we were going with offices was also unsustainable.
In what way?
Well, the density that we were creating in cities was becoming problematical. Millions of people travelling even more millions of miles every day into ever more crowded centres. It's just insane to keep doing that. And it was, we have bits of infrastructure that are breaking. So I'm on the Central Line going into London. When I first moved here to the leafy suburbs of Loughton, I always used to be able to get a seat. But it's now the case that the trains are always busy and you often don't get a seat. And there's no real way of expanding that bit of infrastructure. And yet they keep building more houses because more people want to commute into the city. So at some point, the whole thing's going to break.
So we've got a load of behaviours and a load of structures, I guess, that we've just accepted.
Yeah.
That can't cope.
Yeah. And the solution, the equivalent of the internal combustion engine, I guess, is remote working. We've had laptops and internet connectivity for a few decades now. Now we're switching over more to that, and we're going to have less and less horseshit to deal with, from commuting and all the attendant problems you get from very high concentrations of people in office blocks.
Do you think that, and I'm thinking particularly our management skills, but do you think our management skills are up to coping on a long-term basis with remote working, remote meetings? Because sometimes I think a lot of the in-office behaviours are all about ego.
I mean, the office it's a sort of related but slightly different strand. The office has been around for a long time, and it was primarily designed to benefit white alpha males. And it's still very much the case. So it actually disadvantages an awful lot of people. It obviously disadvantages women, people with disabilities. It disadvantages introverts, as I'm sure you've discussed before.
White alpha males, extroverted males is probably
Well, most alphas are pretty extroverted. Yeah, so it wasn't actually working very well beforehand. And you're right, a lot of the behaviours were based around that model. So even people who were introverted would ape that extroversion, and a lot of the aggression you get in offices is people who are aggressive in offices were the ones who set them up, really, and thrive in those environments. Less collaborative, more what's what I'm looking for, oppositional approach.
So I suppose things I always associate with the offices, things like 9 to 5, 5 days a week, are almost endemic within it, because that fits within the whole control paradigm that you're implying exists there.
Yeah, it's also, that's just become accepted. As was, the model that was created. I mean, it's almost, I mean, I've described offices before as desk factories, that's
and
really
lots of
idea.
presenteeism.
Yeah, exactly. And we have all these behaviors and routines that we've just accepted because that's been the norm. And the point I was trying to make with my post was that, well, one norm has actually bitten the dust now, which is going to the office. So my question is then, well, what else can we change? We're not going to be commuting every day into work anymore, which was never really sensible.
And I see more and more articles now saying, and there was a Zoom thing, I think it was yesterday or today, where they'd done a big survey, and people are not wanting to go back, certainly full-time, 5 days a week into the office.
No, I mean, you think about the typical sort of development of someone's life is when you're young, you want to be in the centre and out meeting people and stuff. But as you get older, your needs and desires change, maybe start a family. You want somewhere with a bit more space, a bit more peace and quiet. So you move out to the suburbs or the country to have a better lifestyle. And what you pay for that is you're then actually not in the place that you want to be as much as you could be because you're too busy commuting. You're spending a load of money on this commute. And really what you've traded is, maybe being in the city every day to only spend, so you're where you want to be all the time, to only being able to be where you want to be at the weekends, because during the week, you're too busy commuting. And then come the weekends, you're too knackered to enjoy it. So you've got to have a lie-in on Saturday morning to have enough energy to enjoy the rest of the weekend. And now people have had a break from that. That was, and a lot of people made that decision, and they made it logically and of their own free will and volition. And I think now they're looking at it and thinking, that's insane. Like, why am if I've made all this effort to come and live in this community because this is where I want to be, and I'm never here because I'm always on the bloody train, or even, another area to look at is business traveling. How often have we spent like a day traveling to a meeting that takes an hour?
How good do you think we are at meetings remotely? And I don't just mean meetings as in team meetings, but you and I have had the benefit of, we've met each other. If I am going to a meeting, a sales meeting or whatever, a remote meeting is a very different skill set to a face-to-face one. How good do you think we are at that?
So I would take issue with saying, just grouping all these things together as meetings. There are lots of different types of interaction, and they take place in different situations at different stages of a process. So if you look at something like a sales meeting, then that interpersonal connection can be very, very important, because you've got to build rapport, get the understanding. But in other sales situations, it's actually not that important, because the person who's doing the purchasing has already done their research online. They know what their requirements are. They just want a confirmatory conversation, check out a few details, and they're good to go. They don't actually need someone sitting in front of them to do that. That is something that could be done remotely.
It reminds me of a discussion I once wound up some salespeople with, which was, there's a big difference between a salesperson who helps a customer to understand their needs and how their company can fulfill those needs, which is what I'd call selling, as opposed to what you just described, which I described almost as order fulfillment. Here am
Yeah.
I, I've done the research and a couple of questions, and then I'm going to buy it.
Yeah, and because one is about creating something, I would say. You're creating an understanding, maybe helping to design a solution. And the other one is more of a routine interaction. So you see the same in team meetings, for example. So if you're trying to set up a project and you're in that, I'll use a horrible word now, but the ideation phase, you're trying to figure out what the hell you're trying to do and how you're going to solve the problem. What is the problem? Then that's something that probably does work better when everybody's in the room. Got the post-it notes and the whiteboards, and you can spend time kicking stuff around. But once you've got the project up and running and you're doing progress meetings, you've got an agenda, you've got action points to go through. It's a very straightforward sort of exercise, and that actually works better online because people haven't got to schlep all the way into some central location. And it also, you get one of the great benefits of online is it equalizes power and presence. So you don't get so much of people dominating the conversations or driving things.
Interesting one, because I've spoken to lots of people over the last 18 months who would argue that introverts, in the way you've just implied, fare better in online meetings in an online world. And at the same time, I've known many that have struggled a lot because sometimes in an online meeting, the magnification, the person that's talking gets a lot more ability to keep talking, unless you've got a facilitator who presses mute a lot, which can more easily drown out the introverts. I think there's something interesting in there.
No, it is a problem.
It certainly leads towards the facilitation skills are much more important online to get everybody included.
Yeah. I think a lot of meetings are pretty badly run, unstructured, unnecessary, unproductive.
That might be a great time, Colin, to go, we're running out of time. Because otherwise this becomes like one of the meetings we're talking about, which can go on and on and on. Just before I close off, what I always ask my guests is for a tip for an introvert. What are your...
The approach to decrapify work is really to start to find things that annoy you or that you think can be better and start to try and make some small changes by gathering a group around. The pirate approach of breaking a rule and replacing it with a better one and forming a crew do that. That requires, that getting people together and finding out the commonality of an issue that you want to change requires a lot of one-to-one conversations, which is something introverts are good at, talking to people and listening to them.
And I love that pirate approach.
Finding out the point of commonality. Introverts, being an outspoken rebel doesn't really come natural to introverts. Finding other people and having a chat with them about some sort of common grievance and then agreeing that, actually, we're going to do something about this together.
Really interesting, because I've got a big AGM coming up this weekend. And one of the things, some contentious stuff that's being discussed. And I'm suddenly, as you said that, I'm reflecting on what I've been doing. And I've been building lots of one-to-one discussions together before the meeting. Perhaps you've got something that could help an extrovert who's managing introverts through this period of horseshit and change?
The advice for extroverts is always listen, talk less, listen more.
And Colin, one final question for you. When people want to get back in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, they can follow me on LinkedIn under Colin Newlin, where I post quite regularly, or decrapifywork.com.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking.
Thanks, John.
What would you like to know about introversion in business? This week is a continuation of a theme from the last couple of weeks. How can you spot an introvert? It's not always as simple as it could be to manage introverts if you don't know that they're introverted. There is no one obvious sign, but a series of ideas that can help you. We've examined some in the last couple of weeks. This week, conversation speed. Introverts are not slow and don't take longer to manage. However, they tend to think to talk, where extroverts tend to talk to think. This can make some gaps in the conversation. So if you notice some people tend to give slightly longer pauses and others do so far less often or rarely, it could be another practical sign. By the way, let them use that gap. Don't answer for them in that gap. Don't jump into it, or they'll easily believe that you're not interested.
I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful.
There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.